One Nation candidate for the seat of New England, Brett Larkham there. Staying in the New England, and the Australian Labor Party has been naming candidates up and down the country as the federal election draws ever closer. In this region, they've named Laura Hughes as the candidate to take on Barnaby Joyce. Mrs Hughes took on Mr Joyce in the 2022 federal election and secured over 5% of a swing towards her on the primary vote. Mr Joyce, of course, is no easy target. He was the former leader of the Nationals, as well as Deputy Prime Minister. But Mrs Hughes insists that she is the better candidate and the better representative for the New England. I spoke to her in the studio earlier this week. Well, Laura Hughes, welcome to Firstline. How are you feeling about announcing your campaign?
Look, it's really exciting. I've really waited 3 years to announce it because I was fortunate enough to be their Labor candidate 3 years ago, and we did really well. We improved the Labor primary vote, and a lot of people in Labor encouraged me to go again. And I think with that experience under my belt, I've got a good chance of having a good campaign.
Now, the New England electorate, of course, has changed quite a bit for this election. One of the aspects, of course, is that you will be appealing to voters in the Upper Hunter as well as the New England Northwest. And there's quite a few different issues around that, particularly around nuclear power with the Liddell Power Station. But we've also got the main fact that this is deep national territory. Do you actually think that you might have a chance of actually taking the seat from someone as high profile as Barnaby Joyce?
I think I've got a good shot, and I think you've just identified possibly why. I think we now have we do have Muswellbrook now in the electorate, and we know that there's a lot of people in Muswellbrook. Dan Repicoli won that seat last federal election, and he's going to support me and sort of hand over Muswellbrook to me in the next little while. And so I think there'll be some people there who aren't, those rusted on national voters that people think of. I'm getting down to Muswellbrook and speaking to them, and then obviously over the whole electorate. And I think people are beginning to realise that they do have choices. They don't just have to walk into the polling booth and go, oh, and choose just somebody, not really think too much about it. So I'm hoping that they'll think about it.
One of the big things, of course, however, that is still really dogging the Albanese government is the cost of living. Given the fact that that has been a major issue, particularly for areas like Tamworth, which is seeing grocery prices increase, housing prices increase, this is a major issue, and there is that deflection towards the federal government being at least partly responsible for this. How would you actually prioritise trying to bring that cost of living down? Because many people need those pressures to be released sooner rather than later.
That's a really good question, Daniel, and thanks for asking. That is absolutely true. We go through cycles like this where costs can get higher and wages aren't necessarily keeping up with those costs. We had the great news last week that our inflation rate is now down to 2.4%, which is fantastic. And I think there's a hope that next week the Reserve Bank will also consider cutting interest rates. They haven't done that for a really long time. And I think that they have a goal of between 2 and 3% for inflation, so 2.4 is right there. And I know that we've worked very, very hard to get that down to 2.4%. So that's great news. And at the same time, as you know, Labor is the party that supports workers. And in many workplaces, workers have received a pay rise over the last 3 years, and some of them have received substantial pay rises. For example, Labor made a focus of early childhood care workers and aged care workers, because they're the people doing the really hard work for our young people and our old people, and they've both received substantial pay rises in the last little while. So we're really trying very, very hard to do what we need to do for the people of Australia and people of New England.
An interest rate cut would certainly be a major boost for the Prime Minister. When the Reserve Bank meets and either decides to cut rates or leave them on hold, do you think that could have an impact on whether or not he will call an election? Because there's speculation it could be mid-April, or he might hold it off till May.
That's a really good question, and that question's in my mind as well. And I think an interest rate cut's good for all Australians. even superannuants, because they might be not necessarily wanting a rate cut, but they've had the benefit of inflation decreasing. So I think it's going to be great for all of us, for everybody. And yes, possibly that will be part of the decision-making process as to when the election is held. The latest we can go is the 17th of May. It's now the beginning of February. I think we're going to get an announcement in the next month or two. Your guess is as good as mine.
One of the big things, of course, is that you are going up against Barnaby Joyce, former Deputy Prime Minister, former leader of the Nationals, current Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. He is certainly someone that we know very well, despite what he may say or do, and he's had a very controversial year last year. But many people say, well, that's just our Barnaby. How, as the Labor candidate, can you overcome not just someone who's very well known personally, but it looks like that many voters just prefer his style of politics because he's very upfront and we know many ways what he's thinking?
Look, that's a good question, and I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that, if I may. I just think people vote for Barnaby because they don't think too much about it, and perhaps you could argue that they haven't. This will be his fourth or fifth election in New England, perhaps haven't been aware of their options. So I believe that I am a good option. I'm a good alternative option. I'm a better choice. I asked people last time, and this time already I'm going around and asking people, can you tell me what Mr Joyce has done for you? Can you tell me what Mr Joyce has done for the electorate? What has he achieved? And I just get a blank stare. I've not had one person say, oh, this and this and this. Not one. Literally, not one person has been able to say clearly what they think Mr Joyce has done for the electorate. So, and remember last time the big issue was Dungowan Dam. Well, he was the Deputy Prime Minister and he couldn't get that through. So I don't know that we can rely on him to get things done for us.
He's also been very prominent in every interview you would hear about so-called swindle factories and intermittent power. Climate change, we know, is one of the most pressing issues that we are having, and this could have a massive impact on the agricultural sector. Then that will have various knock-on effects at the moment. What is your take on, at the moment, renewable power? Because there does seem to be this aspect that renewables are a good mix, but we need something else to be thrown into it. The main thing from the coalition, of course, with the abut phrase is nuclear, but is Labor looking at eventually going to just relying solely on renewables over the next period of decades?
That's a really good question. You're absolutely right. Climate change is a real issue. We're filming this in the first week of February. There's rain falling in North Queensland, and Australians are really struggling with that because there's, metres of rain falling every day.
And one person has tragically died already.
I know, and we can't ignore it. It is pointless. It is actually wrong to ignore that is happening. We must take our responsibility seriously about that. And I'm really glad you asked about energy because in only 3 years, Labor has really invested heavily in energy, building up our infrastructure so that we can carry this renewable energy, big battery packs, and then the grids so that the energy that's being produced by various forms of renewable energy, such as solar, such as hydro, such as wind, can be put into the system and taken to where it needs to go. And they're doing that all across Australia. And as you can imagine, Australia's such a large place, that's frightfully expensive. So they've bitten the bullet and put in money for that, and that will continue with the next Albanese Labor government. So, and I know people are doing their homework. Nuclear, for example, there is a couple of nuclear plants being built in England, in the UK, and they are years overdue, years, and billions of dollars over budget. I can't give you exact numbers, but billions of dollars and years delayed. So they were meant to have been built in the next couple of years. It's looking like it's going to be another 15 years or something like that. It's just crazy. So I am very sceptical of the possibility of nuclear. I think Australia is such a unique country with our sun, with our hydro and with our wind. It's a no-brainer.
But many of these projects, however, especially in areas like the New England, some have been more popular, like the smaller scale Manila Solar, which however is very small to contribute.
Aren't they doing a great job? It's community oriented.
Yes, while it might have that kind of popular support, it's not going to provide as much support and as in the electricity network as a larger scale project. And many of these larger scale projects out for places like Nundle and even within the New England Renewable Zone are not popular because of the way that these companies have been talking about, have been approaching farmers and talking about what these actually would mean. And there is this major issue about later on, like the lifespan of wind turbines, for example, and how much solar panels are needed for many of these projects, though.
Yeah. Look, good questions again. Any system needs to be considered. Seriously, it needs to be looked at as it goes along. We might need to make adjustments in our plans. So it's not it's not the panacea. It's not the thing that's going to fix everything straight away. And it also takes time. And you're right about the community involvement. If the community is on board and it's explained to them and they're given factual information, not, calling wind turbines silly thing, giving them silly names, that's not helpful. That's not information. I think most people are prepared to do a bit of homework and find out about those things. There is evidence to suggest, for example, if farmers allow some solar panels on their fields, on their pasture, they have less loss of water because the sun's shining on the panels, not on the ground, and their animals have some shade, and it works quite well for them, and they've got a reliable source of income in those years where the other income isn't as good. So there's lots and lots of pluses, but you're absolutely right, you need to get the communities on board.
One aspect too is that there's also a bit of confusion, I think, among voters that still resonates to this day about the responsibilities of the various state, local and federal governments. As a main clear point, what would you be wanting to bring for a federal government under Labor, with you as the member for New England, directly to the people as something that's tangible? I know you've often spoken about the Medicare hubs that have popped out.
Look, that's been a great success, and that's been helpful. Several thousand patients have been seen at the Tamworth Urgent Care Clinic since it opened a bit over 12 months ago, and that's really relieved the ED department in Tamworth and provided a spot for families when it's difficult to get into a GP. I'd like to see more of those in our electorate. There's various other towns I think that would be feasible.
And we need some of the major ones, because we are currently in Tamworth, we've got GPs who can't take patients until March. And even if you go to the Medicare clinic, you can be still there for hours upon hours waiting.
That's right, which is clear evidence that it was needed and clear evidence that we need to do more. And this is across all of Australia. It's not just for us. But the decision was made based on the number of people who went to the emergency department. So we didn't get the urgent care clinic because Mr Joyce is our member. We got the urgent care clinic because Tamworth had one of the busiest ED departments for the number of residents who lived in the area. So that's why we got it.
One of the big issues, though, is that while people have been going to the Tamworth one, the Armidale one had to be shut after a number of weeks because they couldn't get the staff to be in there. And that's been a massive issue, especially given Armidale is a significant area of the New England Northwest. And one of the big problems that we are still having from a federal and state government position is the fact that we cannot get nurses, doctors, and particularly specialists to come up to this region. I remember that there have been various proposals that if we have international doctors and students who come to Australia to study medicine or practice medicine, they must stay in a regional area for a certain number of years. What would you think that could be at least some type of temporary solution, or at least try and get ways to get more people to be encouraged in taking up something like a GP or even a nursing position?
Those sorts of programs already exist, and some of them have existed for a very long time. There's a number of things that the federal government does, and I have to say, it's Labor that started them over the decades, encouraging, even at the level of medical student. So they might offer some support when a young person is studying medicine and then that young person agrees to, for example, do their first 3 years in a regional centre, for example. And there's various other programs that exist that provide incentives. Even once someone establishes as a practice, there's support to establish a practice or go into a practice, financial support, and there's a whole range of programs. A lot of people don't know that they exist, but the federal government does a number of things to support doctors and other health professionals coming into the area. And you're absolutely right, there is a shortage. There's a shortage in pretty much every workforce, and a shortage in every workforce in every part of Australia. I don't think there's anywhere that's got a glut of, tradies or various other employment groups. Certainly not in regional Australia. So yes, we will be doing more for that, for sure.
Not to mention that Tamworth itself is facing this skills shortage, but at the same time people are moving into the city, but that's, even though that might be filling certain positions, it's not targeting the positions that are really crucial, especially in areas that might be considered more problematic to fill, which can be certain areas in the industrial sector or the agricultural sector. At the same time, we also have the fact that this is also driving up housing and rental prices. Right now, in Tamworth, for example, its housing price for a median rental property is up 4.3% in the past year. An average property is about $539,000, but that varies depending on where you are in Tamworth. A lot of these things is the fact that we need homes for people, but often they're priced out of the market.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the housing it's become a clear issue. It's been happening gradually. It's not just suddenly happened. And the thing with something like housing, and it applies in any area that you look at, you need to look at the supply and you need to look at the demand. So you can do things like first home owners incentives and schemes and things like that, things to encourage people, making stamp duty less for certain buyers of homes, that sort of thing. But then the supply. So you need to build places and get them happening. I just saw on Albo's social media feed, he had a photo with a whole lot of apprentices and they were involved in building, I think it was in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, I think that's where they were, and they were involved in, they were learning their trade, but building housing for Australians. So we're looking at both inputs, both the supply and the demand, rather than ignoring it or just going, well, tough luck if you can't afford a house or you can't find somewhere to rent. That's not our problem. They're actually doing something about it.
And it looks like a lot of issues are that Labor seems to be, in some aspects, struggling to connect with voters. We've seen polls that have Peter Dutton as the preferred Prime Minister and the Coalition ahead on the two-party preferred, and this could all come down to preferences. There's that strong possibility we could have a hung parliament, which could mean that the Teals, Greens or whoever independents could be holding that balance of power. Given what the situation is, why is Labor still struggling? Because it's very rare that we have a one-term federal government, but there is that possibility that this could happen, and a lot of it seems that people have been moving away from Labor.
People have been moving away from the major parties for a couple of decades, no two ways about it. And it is possible that in the future, Australia will be more likely to have a government made up of people of various parties and various persuasions. New Zealand has a similar sort of, has an arrangement like that. Labor might get the majority, the equivalent of the National Party might get the majority, but they don't usually get enough to form government by themselves.
Because it makes member proportional for them.
Correct. I think that's a reality that we're going to look at. And I mean, I'll give you some evidence. The Gillard government was the most productive parliament since Federation. The Gillard government that had to compromise, they were a minority government, and they had to compromise and talk to various people. And we all know that New England was held by Tony Windsor at the time, and that was a difficult decision for him to make, but we benefited greatly from that. If we look back at the things that we got in that short period of time, we were very fortunate to get those things come to our electorate in various towns. And it is possible that Labor will form a minority government. So the way the numbers stack up at the moment, I believe we're going back to 150 electorates. We went from 150 to 151. I believe we're going back to 150, which is interesting. But either way, you need 76 to form government, 76 seats in the lower house to form government. Labor has more than 76 at the moment, but not heaps more than 76. The National Party has 15 lower house seats, and the Liberal Party has 40, so they have 55. So they need to get more than 20 seats to form government.
And of course, they're also dealing with the fact that you have the Teal independents as well as a strong possible independence, and for Labor and the coalition, One Nation, depending on where they are, could have some sort of sizable vote.
Yeah, so I think there's 12 or maybe more than 12 people who don't belong to the two major parties, ID, the coalition or Labor. So it is very unlikely that Peter Dutton will be the Prime Minister, because it's very unlikely he's going to get more than 20 seats to flip to Liberal or National Party.
Do you think he's too divisive as a leader because of how controversial he has been in the past?
I've had conversations in the last week with a number of people about the kinds of things that he's saying, and they sort of go, you know, is that for real? And I said, well, you've got to take him on his word on what he's saying, and I think he's seeing what's happened in America, frankly, and he's thinking, well, that might work. But I actually think Australians are more open-minded, and I think Australians are prepared, maybe not right now, maybe when we get close to the election, but I think they're more prepared to do their homework and look at the policies and look at the track record of Labor of this first term and make their mind up. And you mentioned Labor being unpopular and, you know, Dutton looking like a preferred Prime Minister. Labor's numbers have improved in the last week or two, quite a bit, so we're hoping for that trend to continue, and I think people are starting to take notice of what they've seen happen in the last 3 years. I don't discount the fact that across the whole entire world people are struggling with cost of living. A number of factors have contributed to that. You can't put it all at the door of governments. It's global factors that can influence all of that, but I think we're going to improve, and people are going to be considering us for sure.
There is also a big concern given the political instability in the US with Donald Trump imposing these tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and those countries responding. One of the biggest problems and concerns within the National Party itself has been, what if Donald Trump, for whatever reason, decides to impose tariffs on Australian beef exports and Australian agricultural exports, which could have a massive detrimental effect on their livelihoods, because given the fact that we have had to move away from the Middle East because of the live export ban, which is still very controversial among many Australian farmers, and moving towards the United States, given the fact that we are having this situation that could be potentially unstable or very uncertain, what kind of impacts could tariffs actually have on Australia? Because the last thing we want to get involved is a trade war that's not of our own doing.
Well, I think the first thing that would happen is I think that we would negotiate and approach the US and talk about how we've been a strong ally of theirs. And we've got, you know, amazing Foreign Minister in Penny Wong, amazing Agriculture Minister in Murray Watt, and Trade and Agriculture. And I think that they would be heading themselves over to the US and having a bit of a chat with the federal government in the US and asking them why they see that benefit in doing that, and encouraging them not to do that. So I think they would try and head them off at the pass and avoid that from happening.
And even though this is not necessarily a major issue federally for us in the New England, it is one that does affect us, and that is the current issues going on in Gaza. And we know that at the moment there have been a variety of, ranging from Jewish voters to Muslim voters, but also those who are more of a pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli bent, that depending on what the federal government does or doesn't do, they certainly seem to turn off or head towards whatever those actions are. While we know that there have been issues with some of the more socially conservative Islamic seats, particularly that Labor holds, that are possibly at risk. We also have had issues around Senator Fatima Payman at the moment. Given that we are also having these anti-Semitic attacks in areas like Sydney, and even Wee Waa the other week, and people are saying that Labor typically should be aligning themselves with the pro-Palestinian movement, which has scared the Jewish community, and if the Labor aligns with the Jewish community, that scares the pro-Palestinian community. This could be a major issue where Labor could be losing a lot of votes, and we saw that that's actually what happened in the US in their presidential election over how that situation has been unfolding.
Look, I think you've made some really valid points there, and it is a vexed issue for sure. And I think Labor, probably among Labor voters and Labor supporters, there would be a range of opinions for sure, which I would expect because we are a party that welcomes all sorts of people with all sorts of opinions and all sorts of points of view for sure. Again, I think that Labor really shines in their diplomacy, and I'm absolutely certain that they would be working on that right at this point in time. I know that the Prime Minister, Albo, has spoken about the anti-Semitic things that have happened in recent weeks and how sad that is and how inappropriate that is and frankly un-Australian. So I know that that people would be looking to that and hopefully feeling confident and safe in the comments that the Prime Minister has made. Again, like I said, not an easy issue, not straight and not black and white. I mean, making it out to be black and white is dumbing it down and making it too simple. It's a very complex issue, for sure.
And before we finish up, one major issue, of course, is that many of Tamworth's Indigenous community are still hurting from the Voice referendum campaign, which, when I've been observing it, it really was not a fantastic campaign that was done by the proponents. I think in many ways it was very confusing. People weren't even sure if it would make any big difference at the moment. We know that the fallout from that has been particularly hurtful in major areas with significant Indigenous populations. But we're still seeing areas where life expectancy is still poor, unemployment, domestic violence. This, even to a degree, some racism still being thrown about. How can Labor actually at least alleviate some of these issues? Because there are people out there who are suffering.
Yep, that's for sure. I was actually quite involved in the Yes campaign. I believed very much in it. I met a range of really interesting people across the area, and I was pretty disappointed with the result personally. The New England electorate had one of the lowest Yes votes in Australia, I think in the lowest 5 of the 150 electorates in Australia. So that I was personally disappointed. However, there are a number of programs that are happening. I was actually talking to someone who hails from Moree, and this is at a state level, but Chris Minns has been up to Moree 8 or 9 times to talk to the folk up there about the issues with crime, for example. And we all know that sometimes crime is committed by young Indigenous people, not always, certainly not always. And again, like I said before, it's a really complex issue. You know, I think yelling at them and saying terrible things about them is not at all helpful. But to me, that's an example of how Labor is prepared to get in and talk with the stakeholders, the local people, and try and come up with some solutions. And I know that Moree is very grateful for that. For example, Moree's not in our electorate, but that's an example of the kinds of things that Labor does. I'm actually, as I'm sure you know, Daniel, I'm a volunteer. I've been a volunteer breastfeeding counsellor for over 30 years, and I'm a trainer and assessor, so I train lovely young mums to become counsellors like me. And I'm actually having a meeting pretty soon with TAMS, the Tamworth Aboriginal Medical Service, how I can support them and their young mums. And so one of their staff members I'm going to have a meeting with her. I'm also on a committee at the hospital that supports the maternity services at Tamworth Hospital. And I go from that community's perspective and help the hospital consider different perspectives. And That's another area, midwives and nurses, where we need more. And they're doing a lot. They're doing as much as they possibly can to try and get people to work. And we're getting lots of people from overseas to come and work in this amazing country, Australia. So I do think, for me, Labor is the party for Indigenous people. It's just, I can't see an alternative, quite frankly, because I just don't think, particularly the National Party, really, I haven't heard anything from them in a very long time that supports Indigenous people. It was frustrating. The referendum was frustrating because there was misinformation, and it was dumbed down and made black and white and all of that, and it really wasn't like that. But anyway, we move on, and we will always be there for Indigenous people, absolutely.
Laura Hughes, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate your time.
Federal ALP